Hello everyone, it's Jabara here. Happy Black History Month. Welcome to the next episode of a series of short videos that I plan to release periodically covering Black history that goes back farther than the Civil Rights Movement and prior to the Civil War, and much deeper than the transatlantic slave trade, and beyond the largely negative narrative that dominates the field of Black history. In this series, we're going to take a journey into the lives, experiences, achievements, and just overall interesting facts about people from Africa themselves. Today, we will be discussing perhaps one of the most impressive indigenous medical practices in history, prior to the modern era. Prior to the 20th century, for every 1,000 American births, 6 to 9 women died, and roughly 100 children died before their first year of life. The deaths of the mothers and babies alike were usually linked to maternal death, largely due to complications with blood loss or infection. Today, the number of maternal deaths has declined to less than 0.1 reported deaths per 1,000 live births, and less than 5.7 infant reported deaths per 1,000 live births. Rapid advances in modern medicine have facilitated this drastic reduction, with much of this being credited to the practice of the cesarean section, or more commonly known as the C-section. The C-section as we know it is a procedure in which the child is delivered via a direct abdominal incision in the uterus. Because of the large size of the human head and shoulders, vaginal births have traditionally led to high mortality rates among women as a result of tearing and all of the subsequent blood loss and infections that result from it. Today, around 32% of all births in the United States are carried out using the cesarean section. Despite the fact that the cesarean section's namesake comes from Roman dictator Julius Caesar, he was not born this way, and the cesarean section as we know it today is actually a pretty recent phenomenon. This procedure was known since antiquity in various parts of the world, but it was typically conducted as a last resort on a mother who was already dead or probably gonna die anyway. For the most part, doctors around the world did not consider the C-section to be a safe procedure for keeping both the mother and the child alive until the dawn of the 20th century, with one notable exception. Unsuspectingly, this exception existed in the Great Lakes region of Central East Africa, more specifically, the Kingdom of Banyoro. Historically, this region has been home to several indigenous kingdoms, many of which were known to have conducted successful C-sections indigenously, prior to the introduction of the Western method. According to British explorer and medical student Robert William Falcon, the region in which we know today as Uganda was unique in the fact that the procedure was conducted with the intent of keeping both mother and child alive. This is exemplified in several ways, one being just how clear it was that the surgeons in question had deep knowledge of how to prevent blood loss by applying pressure and dressing wounds with needles and bandages. They displayed very intimate knowledge of sanitation and infection as well, as they utilized alcohol and herbal pastes to prevent infections. Robert William Falcon personally observed a successful operation after his curiosity was aroused when his guide approached him asking if he'd like to see a woman cut open. The guide then informed him that the woman in question had been in labor for 2 days, and the midwives had given up on delivering the child and turned the woman over to the men. He recalls the operation in this long and highly detailed account. So far as I know, Uganda is the only country in Central Africa where abdominal section is practiced with the hope of saving both mother and child. The operation is performed by men and is sometimes successful. At any rate, one case came under my observation in which both survived. It was performed in 1879 at Kahura. The patient was a fine, healthy-looking woman of about 20 years of age. This was her first pregnancy. The woman lay upon an inclined bed, the head of which was placed against the side of the hut. She was liberally supplied with banana wine and was in a state of semi-intoxication. She was perfectly naked. A band of mbuga or bark cloth fastened her thorax to the bed, another band of cloth fastened down her thighs, and a man held her ankles. Another man standing on her right side steadied her abdomen. The operator stood as I entered the hut on her left side, holding his knife aloft with his right hand and muttering an incantation. This being done, he washed his hands and the patient's abdomen, first with banana wine and then with water. Then, having uttered a shrill cry, which was taken up by a small crowd assembled outside the hut, he proceeded to make a rapid cut in the middle line, commencing a little above the pubes and ending just above the umbilicus. The whole abdominal wall and part of the uterine wall were severed by this incision, and the liquor amni escaped. A few bleeding points in the abdominal wall were touched with a red-hot iron by an assistant. The operator next rapidly finished the incision in the uterine wall. His assistant held the abdominal walls apart with both hands, and as soon as the uterine wall was divided, he hooked it up also with 2 fingers. The child was next rapidly removed and given to another assistant after the cord had been cut. And then, the operator dropped his knife, seized the contracting uterus with both hands, and gave it a squeeze or 2. He next put his right hand into the uterine cavity through the incision, and with 2 or 3 fingers, dilated the cervix uteri from within outwards. He then cleared the uterus of clots of the placenta, which had by this time become detached, removing it through the abdominal wound. His assistant endeavored, but not very successfully, to prevent the escape of the intestines through the wound. The red-hot iron was next used to check some further hemorrhage from the abdominal wound, but I noticed that was very sparingly applied. All this time, the chief surgeon was keeping up firm pressure on the uterus, which he continued to do till it was firmly contracted. No sutures were put into the uterine wall. The assistant who had held the abdominal walls now slipped his hands to each extremity of the wound, and a porous grass mat was placed over the wound and secured there. The bands which fastened the woman down were cut, and she was gently turned to the edge of the bed, and then over into the arms of the assistants, so that the fluid in the abdominal cavity could drain away onto the floor. She was then replaced in her former position, and the mat having been removed, the edges of the wound, i.e. the peritoneum, were brought into close apposition, 7 thin iron spikes, well polished like acupressure needles, being used for the purpose, and fastened by string made from bark cloth. A paste prepared by chewing 2 divergent roots and spitting the pulp into a bowl was then thickly plastered over the wound, a banana leaf warmed over fire being placed on top of that, and finally a firm bandage of mbugu cloth completed the operation. Until the pins were placed in position, the patient had uttered no cry, and an hour after the operation, she appeared to be quite comfortable. Her temperature, as far as I know, never rose above 99.6 degrees Fahrenheit, except on the second night after the operation when it was 101 degrees Fahrenheit, her pulse being 108. The child was placed to the breast 2 hours after the operation, but for 10 days the woman had a very scanty supply of milk, and the child was mostly suckled by a friend. The wound was dressed on the 3rd morning, and 1 pin was then removed. 3 more were removed on the 5th day, and the rest on the 6th. At each dressing, fresh pulp was applied, and a little pus which had formed was removed by a sponge formed of pulp. A firm bandage was applied after each dressing. 11 days after the operation, the wound was entirely healed, and the woman seemed quite comfortable. The uterine discharge was healthy. This was all I saw of the case as I left on the 11th day. The child had a slight wound on the right shoulder. This was dressed with pulp and healed in 4 days. After Robert William Felkin observed this operation, he concluded that it had been practiced within the society for quite some time, considering how highly developed and advanced it was. Additionally, similar practices were recorded in nearby kingdoms like Rwanda, particularly the herbal pastes used for anesthesia. Despite the lack of a solid historical timeline for its development, one thing is for certain: as far as we know, it is the only place in the entire world where this procedure was conducted, preserving the lives of both mother and child prior to the development of modern surgical operations. With all that being said, maybe we should remove the erroneously applied caesarean terminology, and perhaps we should start considering the possibility of calling it the Bonurian section instead. For sources, check out my website, linked below. If you'd like to support future projects, you can do so there as well, or by clicking the join button below, or by becoming a patron. I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching as usual, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.